Hello, Joe.
Hey, David, how are you?
Good. I feel like Walter Matthau and Jack Lemmon brought back for a reunion.
I hope it's one of the earlier ones, like The Odd Couple, and not one of the later things like Grumpy Old Men.
Well, we'll leave it to that. But we are, compared to all these juice box bloggers, I think we are. We belong to the more geriatric set. So I'm very honored to be welcomed back to Blogging Heads.
Me too. But I don't have that great a problem with juice box bloggers, especially some of them who really, really get into the details of issues, like, for example, Ezra Klein on healthcare, which I think is our number one topic today.
Well, Ezra, who's a very good blogger, but went fell a frothy, I think yesterday or the day before yesterday, and accused Joe Lieberman of being party to mass murder by opposing the Medicare buy-in provision, which now looks dead, or at least gravely wounded. I would say thanks to Joe Lieberman. This Medicare buy-in looked to me like a really bad idea, and I'm glad to see it gone.
Well, I think that I agree with you on the substance of the Medicare buy-in, because anything that expands Medicare as it's currently constituted is a pretty bad idea. I mean, the problem with Medicare, actually, let me step back one little bit this year. The most important new factor in the healthcare debate that we've seen this year is the emphasis on how doctors are paid. I don't remember that being part of the debate in 1993 and 94. But what we've learned is that in places like the Mayo Clinic, the Cleveland Clinic, and so on, doctors are paid according to salary. And as long as you have programs like Medicare, where doctors are paid according to, fee for service, according to each blood test that they take, you're going to keep on getting many, many more blood tests than we actually need. And so anything that expands Medicare at this point, I think is not a good idea. However, on the larger point about Lieberman, I do believe that this issue, the public option, and abortion, and several of the other peripheral issues that have come up as deal breakers for various Democrats, really are peripheral. That it's far more important to get a vote on this bill. I would be voting in favor of it, even though I don't agree with major aspects of it. But I think that that Lieberman is playing games at this point.
Well, what is so zany when people complain about the way doctors are paid, and I think that makes a lot of sense. And the system is riddled with perverse incentives, and that's one. But we had solved this problem a decade ago. In the 1990s, private competitive medicine moved a lot of Americans out of fee-for-service into HMOs. It was new. It had a lot of kinks. Some of it, there are problems. And who killed that? Demagogic politicians killed it. They began prescribing all of these mandates on maternity mandate, I think was one I remember, but there are many others, even more at the state level, that had the effect of driving HMOs back out of the market. So this was the great innovation that was supposed to turn around healthcare expenditure. And now we're told that HMOs are, or something like an HMO is okay so long as it's run by the government. But when we had the opportunity to do this a decade ago, it was chased off the reservation.
I don't think that I think that last part isn't quite accurate. I don't think the government would be running HMOs under most of these plans.
Non-fee-for-service medicine. That's the direction, and the president's made it very clear. That's the direction he'd like to see us go, into non-fee-for-service medicine. So we're going to have to. But we had made a lot of progress in that direction, and it was unraveled.
Although there was, the fact is that the pressure against the HMOs was coming not just from patients, not just from Democrats, but also from a great many Republicans and doctors who didn't want to have their purview limited. The thing about this, let's go back to first things here, and maybe we could come to some kind of agreement about a healthcare system you and I would both buy into. Mm-hmm. My history with this is this. The first universal health care plan that I saw that made any sense at all was propounded by Stuart Butler of the Heritage Foundation in the early 1990s. And that essentially was a single payer plan. It took responsibility for health care benefits away from employers. It made all health care benefits taxable. It had a progressive, refundable a tax credit so that people could pay for health care, and it gave them a choice of options in a system of exchanges, kind of like the one that is in this bill. And I think that had several major advantages. One is that it would have made it would have been an entrepreneurial boost for the entire system. It would have made American employers far more competitive with Asian employers who don't have to worry about health care, number one. And number two, there's an entrepreneurial tax that we're all paying by having the current system. There are employees in Silicon Valley firms and in companies all over the country who want to go off on their own, start a company, start building a new business with a new invention, and find themselves locked into their current jobs because their wife has diabetes or they have an autistic kid or whatever. And a true universal healthcare system would liberate the economy in that way.
Well, let me just pause you there, because I think you said a lot of things that I think that are right, but one thing that is wrong. I don't think it's true that the healthcare system makes American firms less competitive. It makes American salaries lower. It is not the employer who's paying for these healthcare costs. It is the employee. I think you're absolutely right about the detriment to job changing that is a consequence of the system. I think one of the other elements that doesn't get nearly enough attention is the element of unpredictability and surprise. That especially for small businesses, it's very difficult to budget what your healthcare costs are going to be, because although if they come out of wages, the check is written by the employer. He has to come up, or she has to come up with a budget, has to guess for the year ahead what it's likely to be, and that's very unpredictable. It's also like it's a huge bureaucratic system and a great time sink. The idea that somebody who's running a specialized, is running a garage with 5 employees also has to master the intricacies of the healthcare system and be a healthcare economist, that is a great waste of time and effort. So on those things I'm with you, and I think that the exchange idea and moving away from employer-provided healthcare to these regulated healthcare supermarkets where small businesses and individuals can compete, can get the benefit of the good deals that can be negotiated by large employers. I think that's a good thing, and to have a certain amount of subsidy mixed in with that is probably inevitable. So that's something, although one can dicker over the exact amount, I think that's also inescapable and probably necessary.
And so is a mandate, I think.
So for sure is a mandate. I think that's right, because what you need to do is to get all the people who are good risks paying into the system while they're good risks. That creates revenues for the system overall, and that the hazards created by allowing people to pick and choose when to buy into the system, especially if we're regulating company. If you're going to have must issue and community rating, then you better have a mandate, or everyone is going to exploit the system and eat for free.
Right, exactly. And there's one other bureaucratic sinkhole involved here that's kind of unexpected. I always wondered, why isn't big business far more in favor of a system like Stuart Butler's, universal health care plan? And the answer is they get lobbied incessantly by their human relations departments, who are afraid that they'd lose their jobs if they couldn't go shopping for health care and negotiate these very wasteful contracts on their own. That also would make our economy a far more efficient place.
Yeah,
but it's I think this is very frustrating, because I think you and I are essentially in agreement on what the system should look like. We're probably in disagreement about what to do now.
That's right. Well, here are a couple more things. That one is, and this may be an ideological assumption, but I think that the force for restraining costs has to be more effective competition. This is, I think, one of the real ideological arguments we're having right now. People on the Democratic side don't believe that markets work in healthcare at all, and they believe that the way you're going to restrain price increase is through having a single payer that can use, to use a technical term, monopsony power. As the only payer, it'll say what everything costs and impose that on providers, and only the government can do that. And so that this whole system of exchanges and competitive private insurers, that's all a way station on the way to where they really want to go. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of Republicans and conservatives are resistant to ideas that actually often originated on the Republican side. I mean, HMOs was a Nixon administration idea. The exchange, as you say, originated with Stuart Butler and the Heritage Foundation. It was Mitt Romney in Massachusetts who enacted the first one. But there is a lack of trust as to what the other side is up to. And because I think a lot of Republicans have a weaker grasp on the details and know they do than their Democratic counterparts, they're afraid of being outmaneuvered into a destination they don't want to go to.
Well, that's not a very good reason to do that. That's the kind of reasoning that gets the pro-choice lobby to the point where they're in favor of abortion after birth, and gets the NRA to the point where they're in favor of everybody being able to own a bazooka. I think that this goes to an argument that you've made, and that is that Republicans had a kind of moral and civic responsibility to play more of a part in the writing of this bill, to raise those concerns. As a licensed moderate, I believe that both the budgetary pressure coming from above plus the market pressure coming from really fully competitive exchanges are going to change the system. It's going to be a matter of both. But in some states right now, you have essentially a monopoly power. Blue Cross is insures 95% of the people, and you have to make sure that the exchanges really are truly competitive to be what you want. And I think one way you do that is by government pressure from above.
Well, the government can regulate them and shape the product that is offered, but the government mustn't be a provider. And indeed, the more important to you the regulatory role of government is, the more important it is that government not be a provider. I don't know if we had it to do all over again, that we would design the public school system the way it exists right now, that if you could start from zero. And we probably can't start this way, and it wouldn't affect housing values. I mean, you'd like to see maybe the government sets the test that every kid has to pass at distinctive times in the kid's life and gets a voucher, and then private providers do it. They don't have to be in buildings that are made out of red brick with white clapboard. It has to be, a school can be anything that meets certain kinds of standards and that has opportunities for innovation. One of the things that we really worry about, we see in more state-controlled systems, and they do some things very well. I mean, I know this Canadian system pretty well. I know the British a little bit. Some things they do well, but they are not innovators. That medicine continues to practice as it's always gone on. And by the way, in these systems, fee-for-service medicine continues to exist because whatever the medical system as it was in place at the time the government entered gets frozen by the dead hand of the state.
Well, one of the difficulties that you have in a mature democracy is how to deal with the problem of evolution. The school system that you described was designed for a newly industrialized country and its paradigm was the assembly line. You move the kids from English to math to history and so on as a group. In the new paradigm, in the information age, the paradigm is the computer network, where education should be far more customized and individual, and incentive based. But you're still dealing with institutions, school boards and teachers unions that insist on, keeping that same old system. And that's what makes change so difficult in a country as mature as this one. Going back to the healthcare debate, it's been very interesting to me to see lobbying groups on both sides of this issue lock on to essentially a peripheral provision, a minor provision, the public option. And the reason why that was done, I know from the left side by MoveOn.org, was that that focus tested best. That's what that's what the most vehement Democratic activists wanted. They wanted to have a public a state-run healthcare system, and it's also the thing that motivated conservatives the most. They didn't want that. But in terms of actually setting up a healthcare system that would improve life for everybody and improve the economy, it was a very, very minor provision, and we tend to get thrown off course by the interests of the extremes rather than, the critical mass in the middle.
But I always thought that it was Rahm Emanuel's job to bring discipline to the Democratic left, and that it was his job to, wrap them on the knuckles and say this is the way it's going to be. I think you and I have talked about this before, that one of the structural differences and asymmetries in American politics is that liberals are a relatively small group in the country and conservatives are a relatively big group. And this creates challenges for both parties. The Democrats have to worry if they do what their base wants, they'll just be way off in the margins of where the country is and will render themselves unelectable. The Republican problem is that because their base is relatively big, it's very easy for the base to control the party, but their base is not quite big enough actually to govern the country. So those are dissimilar problems. But and we are seeing in the Senate a little bit of disciplining of the base. But what was going to now happen is because it's all happening so late, it looks like this plan is going to end up being written on the back of an envelope between Christmas and New Year's.
I don't think that that's true. I think that what you always find in something like this is that it goes to reconciliation between to conference committee between the House and Senate, and those deals are worked out. But I think we know the general shape of this thing so far, except for these issues on the side. And as for your sense that liberals are a relatively small group and conservatives are a relatively large group, I would dispute that a little bit. I think people who say that they're liberals are a relatively small group, and people who say that they're conservatives are relatively large. But
who knows what's going on inside their heads exactly?
Well, when you look at polling on issues like the public option, you see 55-60% of the people are in favor of it, although they're not quite sure what they're in favor of. And when you poll the welfare state, you find an awful lot of conservatives who are in favor of it. So, I find that I would much rather describe the country as essentially a moderate country that has moved to the right over the last 30 years, and I think is moving a little bit back more to the center now.
But as you said, I've been very unhappy that Republicans have not played ball at all on this healthcare issue. I think, and not just for civic and moral reasons, but also politically, because if the Republicans had succeeded in blocking this thing, that we're on a path that is very alarming, and is even more alarming, should be even more alarming to Republicans than it is to Democrats. Because after all, if healthcare spending goes up as a share of GDP from the present, 16 to the 19 that some project, if it goes up as a share, if the public spending on healthcare goes up from 8% to 10% of GDP, what happens? Well, you devour the military budget and you make tax cuts impossible. That's what's happened in every other country that has had this experience. I think it actually should be more frightening as a Republican to think the military will be devoured by healthcare than it is you're a Democrat and a liberal. That would be just, the military will have to have a bake sale then, just the way the bumper stickers promise. So the Republicans need to be in this, and we have a cost control imperative. That is actually the single worst thing about the American healthcare system is the thing that you think would bother people on the right more than people on the single worst thing is that the costs are so undisciplined, and that is a classic green eye shade conservative thing to worry about. Since many of the things that have to be done are unpopular, if you've got a Democratic president who's volunteering to stick his hand in the beehive, why not clap him on the shoulder and say good luck to you?
Yeah, I think that's true. But there's one option that you didn't lay out there. You talked about making tax cuts impossible, and you talked about cutting the military budget. I don't think the military budget is going to be cut over much. I think that one thing you have to say about this president, especially in his choice of defense secretary, is that he's not a left-wing lunatic when it comes to military or military action. He's a pretty moderate guy. But on the tax,
you can have the conservative governments, even right wing governments in Europe, and the Mulroney government in Canada, which a government I knew well, which is a very conservative government, and wanted to build the military, confronted with devouring pressures from rising healthcare budgets. The military gets chopped up.
There is another option that you didn't mention, and that is, oh my God, raising taxes. I think that we have had this 30-year kind of hyper fever about the question of taxation since Reagan. And there's absolutely no evidence that shows that tax increases within a range that gets to about 20% of GDP, does any harm to the economy at all?
But we're talking about a moving target here, because the demands of the state we're going to rise anyway because of the baby boomer retirement. So we are already confronting, even before the healthcare initiative, a likely rise over the next 30 years in the demand on the society by the state. That's, I think, one of the things that you need, and I think that's one of the things that Orzag and the president worry about, is it's not a still target, it's a shifting target. And if you have a situation where the population of elderly people is growing rapidly, at the same time as healthcare costs are growing ultra rapidly, then that is an extremely bad multiplication effect. And that's the reason why, I think Newt Gingrich and others have acknowledged that just the arithmetic indicates that taxes are going to probably be rising somewhat over the next 25 years. But the question is, how big a somewhat is that somewhat? And depending on the choices we make now, that could be a smaller or bigger number. And that's why I think Republicans need to be here, because they say the priority is cost control. And
wait a minute, David,
you can get equally good results at lower cost, is just what every other developed country seems to do.
David, you just acknowledged the probability of tax increases. No wonder the right wing of the Republican Party is having so much trouble with you. I mean, really. Yeah. But I'll acknowledge something that makes the left wing of the Democratic Party crazy about me, crazy with me. They're not crazy about me, for sure. And that is this, that as long as Democratic interest groups like public employees unions continue to block really progressive solutions on issues like healthcare, there's going to be a fundamental disconnect between what the Democratic Party says it stands for and what it actually stands for. I think that, you cannot gainsay the fact that this healthcare bill this year has been crippled by the interests of the public employees unions.
Interesting. And where do you see that crippling effect being exerted?
Well, the fact that they're blocking the revenue increase that should happen, which is to make all healthcare benefits, taxable. Mm-hmm. The main opposition to that are the public employees unions.
But isn't there also a problem that one of the reasons for the enthusiasm for the public option among Democrats is they want publicly administered hospitals, because it is not at all clear that if you have privately administered health provision in a system where there's cost pressure and where there's more effective competition, it's not just that doctors and nurses are not going to be the only providers who are squeezed. It will also be the people in the laundry rooms and the people in the cafeterias. And if your hope is to get all of those people union contracts and see them all paid very high union wages, that a more competitive system without a public option threatens their interests too. And the interest of their would-be representatives.
I don't think it's thought through that clearly. I think that what you have, the main motivating force there is the interest in, or the belief that insurers are essentially crooks, and the desire to limit their profits, which is the real motivating force in terms of the public option, not the broader sense that it would change the workforce.
All right. Well, this is something that strikes me. This is my most heretical thought. It's a equal opportunity to both parties. As I look at the American healthcare system, the problem seems to be the insurers are way too weak. The providers are strong, the insurers are weak. And the insurers, that's what the whole HMO fight was about. That the one time America got serious about disciplining providers, there was, as you say, doctors and nurses and patients to a lesser degree strike, and they won. They crushed them. And the insurers backed off because the insurers, people don't see the costs. It's subtracted from their wages before they ever know what their wages are going to be. Why do the insurers need to have all of these fights? And they live on the markup anyway. They don't care what the base price is they're marking up, and they have no power. And that one of the things that we ought to be thinking about when we think about cost control is not how do you have monopsony power by the state, but how do you make the insurers more effective? So one of my thoughts is I'm not sure that state exchanges are a good idea. I'm wondering whether that the way we ultimately don't want to go is toward a national exchange, and you want to move to a system where there are 5 or 6 insurance providers in the whole country. And they have enormous
or how many
power.
the market will bear. I mean, I think that they have to certainly be more than 4 offering different. I mean, the federal employees health benefits plan is really the model for this, which is a national exchange, which has a range of, a dozen options. My bit of heresy here would be to want to include a Medicare savers account as one of those options. Just try everything, try a range of things and see what works. That's one of my arguments in favor of school choice as well. We need to see what actually works these days. But I disagree with your argument about the insurers because they retain some really strong power. They could always raise their rates, which they have, and which we've all been paying for.
But that's not a sign of their.
They can deny coverage.
That's not a sign of their power. Sorry, if you said
that's a kind of passive aggressive power, though, isn't it?
Well, I mean, imagine they're Walmart. Imagine they're Walmart, and there's some Chinese manufacturer of toys, and Walmart's view was, look, you just tell us what those toys are going to cost. We can always raise prices to our customers, and if the customers don't like it, we can always fire the customers. That wouldn't be the scary Walmart of the liberal nightmare. The scary Walmart of the liberal nightmare walks into the Chinese factory and says, we will tell you what the price of that toy is going to be, and then it says to the customers, we don't want fewer customers. We want more customers. We want all of them. We want every mom and pop shop in the country. We want all of their customers. I remember an essay of Rob Long, who writes for National Review, wrote about what was going to happen to the television era because of the internet. It's an essay called 3 Bean Salad. It was based on the story of a friend of his who made bean salad, which he sold to local Trader Joe's or to local shops. And one day the people from Trader Joe's come into his store and look in his operation, look at the 3 beans. They know exactly what the beans cost, and they say the price of your bean salad is going to be X, which allows you $0.015 profit on every unit. And if you don't like that, we're going to invest in your competitor, and he's going to be providing us with that 3 bean salad. That's power. The Walmart people say that they save every American consumer $3,200 a year, whether that consumer shops at Walmart or not. I don't know if that number is right, but it sounds very credible to me. Their enormous power has driven prices down all through the economy, which makes it lousy to be a provider, but great to be a customer. And that's capitalism. It's lousy to be a provider, great to be a customer.
But I would expand. I don't know that Walmart itself has done that, but I certainly think that free trade or relatively free trade has, and that and that it has worked far more to the advantage of American consumers than the balance has been in favor of American consumers, even keeping in mind the job losses in the manufacturing sector. That's part of I think a natural evolution, although very painful one. Could I ask you, switching the topic a little bit, what your feelings are now about the TARP program, and also about some of the budget choices that the president has made, the stimulus package?
Yeah. Broadly positive on the TARP program. I will be studying it for half a century probably, and minutely examining it. I'm sure that we'll discover lots and lots of things that were not done right. But I think that was one of those things where it was much better to be fast than to be smart. And I've been reading a lot about the catastrophic events of 1929 to 33. And I think one of the things that we need to appreciate much more is how long a period that was, and how 1929, 30, and 31 were one thing, and 32 and 33 were a different thing. And there are all these people now. How
so? What was the difference?
Okay. What happened? The United States economy, the world economy, begins to move into recession in 1928, and the crash announces that recession. And the crash then triggers it triggers a recession, and that in turn has negative impact on. I won't go into all the detail, but it has impact on the international economy of the United States' relationship with Britain and Germany. But still, by early 31, we are in the realm of a normal downturn, not worse than, say, the downturns before the First World War were. At that point, because of the operation of the gold standard, because of bad policy choices, because of the effect on them. Because people didn't understand that bank deposits were money, and that when a bank closed, that shrank the monetary base just as much as if cash was withdrawn from circulation. a series of failures happened that turned what would have been a 7 or 8% contraction in the U.S. economy, which is pretty nasty, nastier than anything we've had since the Second World War, but not nastier than they were used to back then, and that would have been short, into the quarter or 1/3 of GDP disaster. Now, here's what I think about. Supposing we'd sent back a copy of Barry Eichengreen in a time machine to the policymakers in 1931, and they could have opened it and learned, or Milton Friedman's monetary history, and learned exactly what to do. And they had done the right things in 31. Herbert Hoover would still have lost the 1932 election, and we'd remember him as a big loser, and that would have been a terrible time. And we would never have known what was behind door number 2. The door number 2 was German democracy collapses and World War II and all of the terrible things. We're never going to know what's behind door number 2 of TARP. But as we sit here with the world banking system in trouble but not dead, and with something like a recovery, not a very good one, gathering, I think I'm not going to, we can criticize in the classroom. I'm not going to argue too much about what they did. In the same way with the stimulus. I don't like the stimulus that the president did. Too many payouts to Democratic interest groups, and it's going to be it's not temporary enough. It will be very hard, and combined with his supplemental budget that was passed shortly afterward, that he did move the country onto a permanently higher trend line of spending, which was a terrible mistake that's going to be very hard to undo. But a fiscal stimulus was essential. So is inflation. We need, or reflation, we should call it. We need to have the deliberate creation of money. We needed to have a salvation of the banking system, and we needed to have some kind of injection of fiscal stimulus. I would have preferred to take payroll tax holiday because it starts fast, and then you can end it whenever you want.
Once again, these are views that you're expressing that are entirely heretical. Well, I'll tell you, not to real conservatives, but to the public face of the Republican Party at this point.
Let me tell you a story about that. I had an event. I'm sitting here in my house. I was at an event here. We had about 30 extremely bright young people connected with the conservative world. And we were having this discussion. I was propounding some of my heresies to them. And they all hate TARP, and they all hate the stimulus. And so I go through, we go in a more detailed way. Here was the extremity of the situation. You couldn't get credit. Interest rates were practically zero. What would you do consistent with your principles in that case? And there was a long pause, and one of them said, I guess it's a good thing we weren't in power then. Well, that's not a very good answer.
No.
Then who needs you then? Who needs you? I thought it was the liberals who were the good time people. And the point of conservatives were the, in case of emergency, break glass people. And my point is not you jettison your principles. Your principles have to be big enough. If you need to do something to save your country, your principles have to be big enough that thing you need to do to save your country is consistent with your principles.
See, I believe that the last 30 years has really sanded off a lot of the foolish excesses that American liberalism took on after a 30-year period or longer period in power before that, where liberal assumptions were essentially the where the game was from Roosevelt to Nixon, and during that time. The Democratic Party and liberalism took on, some views that were, I thought, out of the realm of reality, especially when it came to foreign policy, and also when it came to social policy, when it came to the idea that notions like blaming the victim and that sort of thing. And the last 30 years have sanded off those excesses. And so what you have now, an American president, no matter how many times people use the term socialism, what you have here in Obama is a guy who is taking a very traditional liberal Keynesian path on the economy, and a very moderate centrist foreign policy. I think that where Democrats get into trouble is in the areas that are still encrusted with both bureaucracy and incumbency. And so, I think that the biggest mistake the president has made this year has been one of style more than substance. That appropriations bill, the $451 billion appropriations bill that you mentioned, he should have vetoed it. He should have said, "There's too much crap in this bill. Yeah. Send me back. I'll approve it if you take out all of the earmarks and the other garbage you've put in here.
It's not just earmarks. It is the trend line that, and I don't think actually, he hasn't been a very good Keynesian. A good Keynesian would say, I need to spend a lot of money right now. I need to do something big right now to stimulate aggregate demand, and whether that is the right kind of pro-consumption tax cut, like the payroll tax cut, whether it's spending that can go immediately into effect. But I also have to confront the fact that the United States has a long-term fiscal problem, and that means that when the crisis is over, I need to reimpose fiscal discipline, and I don't want to do anything in the crisis that will make that job more difficult 3 and 4 years out. And that means do not tamper with the baseline budget. But he allowed his Democratic allies in Congress to do that. And just as I think that one of the things that just as I think the insurers aren't strong enough, in a way, one of my criticisms of the president at home has been, and maybe he's been focused abroad, so he hasn't been a strong enough party leader. That he has allowed his congressional wing way too much scope, both on health care and even more on the budget and the stimulus.
I would agree with that on healthcare, not so much on the budget and the stimulus. I would agree with it also on the appropriations bill. But I think that the most important thing with the stimulus was to get the money out and to have it be as big as you possibly could have it. Now on the budgetary front, I think next year is the year where the rubber really meets the road, because a lot of the Bush tax breaks are expiring. And I think and that's going to be a real test for this president to see whether he lets them expire, and how many of them he lets expire, whether he returns to the Clinton tax schedule, whether he reinstitutes why can I only think of it as the death tax now?
Yeah. I told you we were like the Sunshine Boys because that's why.
But the Republicans think
because that word is never far from one's mind.
Right. It's this is life is an aphasic. Yeah. That's sort of, but I do think that. Are you in favor of letting the Bush tax cuts expire in 2010? I mean, yes. We're still going to be struggling with a very badly damaged economy. And how on earth does it make sense to hike taxes on high-income individuals and small businesses and on corporate on dividends and capital gains? I mean, not that there are so many capital gains out there. I think
why wouldn't you say let's extend them for 3 more years?
I think that you could. I think you can get back to. I mean, you remember what people were saying in the 90s about the Clinton tax rates, that they were going to throw us right back into a recession. They didn't. I think that there are certain tax breaks.
But we were nothing like today's situation back then.
I think that you can restore the 39% upper tax level. I think you could safely do that. I think that you can build in tax breaks and maybe even extend this, capital gains tax holiday that the president has proposed for small businesses and that sort of thing. The inheritance tax that just came to me is something that I think should be restored. There are other ways that we can go to juice the economy. I think that there are adjustments that can be made to fit the economy, but a return to the tax rate structure of the 90s, I don't think is going to cause a return to recession.
Well, good. This allows me to reassert some Republican and conservative bona fides here. I mean, one of the things that I think is I had hoped that in the Clinton years would be left behind by Democrats and liberals is this idea that of good money and bad money. So if a capital gain is earned by a small business, that's good. It deserves a lower tax rate. If it's earned by a big business, it's not. I mean, what you want to have is a transparent, simple tax code that exists to raise revenue for the state and not to intervene in the workings of the society. And that wasn't that a neoliberal insight. I mean, one of the things that was powerful.
That was Bill Bradley's
and I don't know if you still use that term to describe yourself. But one of the things that was powerful about that was to say, you know what, that to be a liberal means to be a Keynesian. It means to be in favor of a welfare state. It means not to be a social democrat and not to be in favor of redistribution.
Well, it depends on what you mean by redistribution. Being a neoliberal means being, at least it used to mean, and it's something I certainly would favor, is being in favor of progressivity. a progressive tax code.
Here's what I mean by redistribution. The difference between a neoliberal and a social democrat is a neoliberal worries about the poor, a social democrat worries about the rich. And the neoliberal says, so long as we don't have too many poor, I don't care how many rich we have. And the social democrat says, I'm willing to have a slightly more poor in order to get rid of those damn rich.
Actually, what really gave rise to neoliberalism, and it came in two waves. The first wave was the Bill Bradley, Atari neoliberal wave, which was very much in favor of tax simplification. The second wave was the New Democratic wave, Bill Clinton, which was very much in favor of tax complication, of special breaks for things that we wanted to encourage and higher taxes for things that we wanted to discourage. And I think that the second wave came with the understanding that the aggrandizement of the rich meant that the middle class was beginning to suffer in significant ways. The New Democratic movement was far more about the middle class than it was about the poor, which is why Clinton won. And in 2000, I think it was very striking that the guy who spoke the most about the poor was George W. Bush, not Al Gore.
Mm-hmm. For sure it's true that middle class incomes have been under pressure, and that's been true for a long time. It was very intensely true in the Bush years, and it was one of the reasons that I think Republicans were in trouble in 2008, even if the crash had happened in November rather than in October. But the single biggest piece of that problem is the rising is the rise of healthcare costs. If you could deal with that, I don't know that. There are a lot of other trends that concentrate rewards on people at the top. We live in a global economy, and that means that, I wrote an article about this for the New York Times, I guess, a year and a half ago, and this is maybe too cute a point, but when I just know by coincidence, the Chrysler building, which was for sale in 2008, had also been for sale exactly 50 years previously in 1958. And when it was sold in 1958, it was sold to a man who lived 5 blocks away. And when it was sold in 2008, it was sold to Abu Dhabi. So if you own an asset in 2008, you have global bidders for your asset. If you have a unique skill, if you're a great surgeon or a great architect or a great investment banker, you have a global marketplace. If you have an ordinary skill, then you're competing with global providers. Then suddenly you are, and every day we find some new way that people in Kuala Lumpur, Bangalore, Shanghai can compete with you, and so you have the global marketplace is a little tougher on you. So that's in the background, but. If you could do something about healthcare, that would do so much for the middle class that you could leave all of those other concerns for a decade or more to worry about them much, much later.
Well, the principle you just propounded is is absolutely true in a global economy. If you'll forgive the expression, Tiger Woods, but too often over the past 10 or 20 years, it's been used to grant just obscene paychecks to CEOs who really weren't very good performers in the first place, but exhibited a skill that is universal, which is an ability to climb the greasy pole. But as far as the tax,
that's the problem of the weakness of American corporate law. That's not an inequality problem because the people who are concerned about the people who are concerned about inequality would be just as upset seeing somebody make a big paycheck from a company that was privately held as publicly traded.
Some would, that's for sure, but a great many others who are, people, someone like me, for example, as a moderate liberal, I think people should be rewarded for brilliant performance, that's for sure. But I think that the system did get twisted out of shape over the last 20 years. But, I guess to wrap this up, on the point that you made about healthcare costs, I'm very heartened to know that you're now on the record in favor of some higher taxes to help pay for it. But I also believe that we're going to need market discipline to help pay for it, and we're going to need some governmental discipline and a broader understanding on the part of the people that, when you're 80 years old, maybe it isn't the best thing for the government to pay for a $120,000 heart murmur operation, that sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I talked about it in the last book I wrote, that we're going to need revenues. And that's why That's why we need to think about, one of the things that conservatives need to think proactively about this, because it is very easy to raise the most destructive taxes in the American system. It's very easy to allow the Bush tax cuts to expire, to allow income tax rates to go from 36 to 39, to allow capital gains rates to jump up. It's easy to raise the payroll tax. That's been done multiple times in American history, most recently in 1983, and it will likely happen again. I guess actually in the Clinton years, they raised the cap on the Medicare tax, so that's another payroll tax increase. Those things are easy to do, and they're the worst taxes. So if you are the party that wants to defend private innovation, private markets, that opposes redistribution for its own sake, then you have to think, well, what revenue raisers do we want? And so I'm in favor of finding ways to do a progressive consumption tax. It doesn't have to be a sales tax. I'm interested in Bruce Bartlett's idea of a VAT. I'm not sure I'd go that far. I like carbon taxes because I think they're useful from an environmental point of view, and they function like consumption taxes. And that can ward off the taxes that we're otherwise going to get, that are going to be taxes on saving, work, and investment. And my vision, one of the things, and I'll do a 5-minute commercial for what I think, it's too bad the term neoconservatism is taken, because we could really use it right now. But neo-conservatism, or neo. But what we need is that says.
How about just plain old conservatism?
Well, the problem is the conservatives don't like it. I mean, they have, and what has happened with conservatism is we tend to fetishize policies, and we confuse policies and principles. So the principle is the free market, limited government, and competition and entrepreneurship. The policy is a supply-side marginal tax cut. And we then turned the supply-side marginal tax cut, which was a response to very specific problems that existed in 78, 79. We say you should always do that. Whether or not you have a supply-side problem, you should always do that policy, and that's a principle. If you don't endorse that, you're not a real conservative. But the core of what I'm trying to preserve is an entrepreneurial economy, an assertive American foreign policy, and a strong sense of nationhood and democratic accountability at a time when nations are kind of in danger of being dissolved into multinational institutions. And that means you need to do some rethinking. And yes, it sometimes means you need to think about how do you finance the government in new ways. And my formula on this is that those who say read my lips, no new taxes, are saying no new thinking. That means you're stuck with the old taxes. And if you want to do something about the old taxes, unless you're going to have a magic wishing wand that gets rid of your government's obligations, you're going to need new taxes to replace them or compensate for them and mitigate them.
Right. And you know what? And I think I have to go and close on this. When you're talking about tax creativity, one area that I would certainly look at is in corporate taxation. Our corporate tax rates are higher than in other countries. And if you can move that into taxing corporations not on their profits, but on their externalities, on their environmental impacts, some form of the carbon tax that you just spoke about, I think that you could get the kind of not only revenue results that you need, but also the environmental results that everybody wants to see. But as I said, and as we've both acknowledged, that kind of creativity becomes harder and harder and harder the more mature democracy becomes. And for us to return to a place in the society where that kind of discussion is even possible by people other than, the two of us, we really have to begin to do what you've been doing, which is to speak out against the extremists on both sides and on the special interests on both sides that really don't want to see creative change.
And we both know how much fun that is, and how many friends you make. I'll leave you with one last thought. During one of the sort of arguments we had, one of the barrages, I was trying to console my wife for some annoying incident that happened. And I was saying, well, the good thing about a situation like this is you really learn who your friends are. And she thought and said, I was happier when I didn't know. Bye, Joe. Good to talk to you.
I'll see you next time, Dave.